It's now time for one of the most fun parts of this project, and that's building a gallery with CSS Grid. And so, yeah, that's exactly what you're going to learn in this lecture. So how to create a complex grid-looking gallery. So one that you can really see that it was built with an underlying grid. And for that, you're also going to learn how to use object fit together with images for grid items. And this is the gallery that I'm talking about. And from the beginning, I wanted to include something like this in this project because it's really a perfect use case for CSS grids. Because you can really see how these items, so how these images, were literally aligned to an underlying grid. So it's really visible, and so it's a perfect use case. And actually, it would have been maybe not impossible, but extremely difficult to do this without CSS Grid. And so again, it's a perfect use case to show you once again how powerful CSS grids are. So how do we go about creating this grid structure? So we have to select the number of columns and the number of row tracks here, of course. And so how are we going to do that? It seems like a rather complex task, right? So a couple of things about that. Well, the most important thing to consider is the smallest unit that you want to have in your grid. So in this case, that would be this cell here. So like this image. So I have to create a grid with as many columns as necessary to create a small image here like this. So one of the columns is the size of this image because it's the smallest unit here. And the same, of course, applies to the row. So you see that the height of one row is the height of this unit here. And this height is actually visible here anywhere over the place. So the height of this unit here is also like, for example, this one here. And so that's going to allow us to place items like this using, of course, some spanning so that it really looks like this huge grid here in the end, with all of these items aligned like this, with some images bigger than the others, like this one and this one, then some smaller ones, and coming in all different shapes. So this one here is in portrait, this here is maybe like a square, this is also here like a square, and this one, so they're similar to the one here. And yeah, so basically the more columns and the more rows you have, the more complex you can create these items here. The more variety in sizes and shapes you can create with the grid, okay? So let us actually take a look at the underlying grid that we have here. So let me select it here from the list, and it's this gallery, okay? So you see that we have 8 columns. So it goes from line number 1 to line number 9, and 7 rows, okay? And I did this through some experimentation, of course, which means that you never come up with this right from the beginning. So maybe I started with 10 columns and 10 rows, and then at some point I noticed that 10 was a bit too much, and then I did an 8 by 8 grid, and then I noticed that I don't even need the 8th row, and so I just cut it to 7 rows. And so in the end, I ended up with this 8 by 7 grid. And you see again that this is here is the smallest unit, and you see this grid cell, for example, over here on this side. And so basically each of these areas that you see here are made up of a couple of these grid cells. So for example, here we have 2 and 2, and here we have 4, and here we have 9 in this image. Here we have like 6, okay? And so again, the more grid cells we have, the more complex and the more variety we can have in these images, okay? So let's set up that underlying grid here in CSS. And of course we need some grid item. So let's start with having just one image so that I can show you how I implemented all of this. Okay, so down here we should have the gallery. And yeah, so I'm going to use an image here and call it gallery img. And this one is going to be called image and then gal1. Okay, and gallery image 1. And actually we're gonna change this here later, but more on that a bit later. Okay, so we can close our homes now and open the gallery file, which is this one. So let's get rid here of this background color, set display to grid, and then add our rows and columns. So grid template columns, And as I mentioned, I made 8 columns, and all with the same size, of course, occupying the entire grid container. And then the rows. So template rows. And remember I said that I have 7. And now what about the height of each of them? So let me show that to you. So what happens when I resize this here? So you see that each of these cells here actually maintains its aspect ratio perfectly fine, right? And so what that means is that the height of these rows is somehow tied to the viewport width, right? And the easiest way to do that is to simply use the viewport width unit, okay? And so that's exactly what I did. And so we have 7 columns, each one with the height of 5 viewport width. And so again, I experimented with these heights, and I came to the conclusion that 5% of the viewport width is the perfect size for the height. Now we of course could have done this in a different way, and that is to basically preset the height of this row. So I mean of this entire row. So basically preset the height of the row that contains this gallery container, and then we could have used the FR unit here as well. And so that would have then divided equally the height of the container by the number of rows. Okay, I hope that doesn't sound too confusing, but I think it's actually a bit more straightforward to do it like this. So using the viewport width unit, and so then that will define the height of this gallery item here, which will then in turn define the height of the row of our overall layout. All right, so let's take a look at that. And so here we go. Maybe I shouldn't have removed the background color here. And actually, yeah, I shouldn't have, because this was actually the correct background color for this element. So let's get it back. And I think it was, yeah, I think it was this one. And yeah, okay. Now let's just quickly add another one. So gallery number 2. Just so that we see how they look like side by side. But I see that they're not really side by side. So let's actually check out what we have here. And now that's really weird. For some reason we have 2 columns and our grid container is way too big, so I'm not sure what's going on here. So like this page is really huge now. But I don't really have an idea why that is happening. So let's inspect element, and it tells me that the gallery is 2000 pixels wide now, which doesn't make much sense. So let's maybe add this page in Google Chrome to see if this is maybe a bug with Firefox. And so I'm just going to copy here the address of our page and open Google Chrome, pasting it here. And we see that our site looks good here actually too in Google Chrome. And so that's good to know. And all right, so now I see what's going on here. And it's because these images are huge. Okay, so for some reason in Firefox it doesn't show up like this. The images are actually quite small. But this shows me why the grid container is so big right now. Okay, and so let's now go back to our code and fix that. So this is just a temporary fix. So let me simply say that I want all of the child elements to have a width of 100%. So that should fix it. And indeed, here we go. So that is much better. And now, well, actually there's still something going on here. I'm not sure what's that, but it's no problem. I'm sure that if I reload the page or something, then that's gonna disappear. Or if not, it's gonna disappear later at some point, I'm sure. Now remember the talk that we had earlier about images as grid items, right? So down here, so up here actually, we had the same thing. So we had images as grid items. And remember that these images, they have an intrinsic aspect ratio. And because of that, they don't really fill the grid cells that they are assigned to, right? So you see that this image here, it's not really filling up just one of these cells, but instead it really overflows it and stretches as much as it has to in order to keep its intrinsic aspect ratio. And the same, of course, with this one. Now, this is going to create huge problems here for our gallery, because these images actually don't have the same aspect ratio, and so therefore this will create a very messy looking gallery, not exactly like we want it to be. And if we add a gap here to our grid, then that's going to make it even worse. So let's actually do that. So a grid gap of 1.5 rem. And as you have noticed, this gap is always only between the columns and the rows, but not on the sides, so not around the grid. But in this case, we actually want some space around the grid container as well. And so let's just add some padding here. So a padding of 1.5 rem as well. And so that's going to look as if the gutter was also on the outside of the grid. So just like that. Okay. So again, we actually want this image to stop here. So in order to only occupy this cell that it was assigned to. I mean, we didn't actually manually assign it to this cell, but the grid auto placement algorithm just put this image here in this first cell and the second image into the second cell. But still, it's overflowing the cell, and that's not the behavior that we want. So how can we fix that? And what we're going to do is a small property that we've used before in another project called object fit. And object fit is perfect for this, because remember that if we set object fit to cover, it's like setting background size to cover for a background image. So basically having an image filling a container. Okay, and so what we're going to do here is to add a parent container for each of these elements, then put the element in there and add object fit to that parent element. Okay, does that make sense? So let me show that to you here in the HTML. And so let's use the figure element here now, which I'm going to call gallery item and gallery item number 1. Okay, and so this is a figure, so I have to put the name in here. And now this is where I'm going to put the image. So let's get rid of this one. And okay, so remember, gallery item is what it's called like. So let's just add that selector. And then for the image as well. And so we actually want the image to have the width of 100%. Right? So let's take a look at that now. And for now, of course, it's still the same. But now it's no longer the image that is the grid item, but the figure element. Okay? And so now let's then actually use the object fit property. And we have to do that here on the image element. So object fit set to cover. Now this is only going to work if you set both the width and the height. Okay, so I once tried making this work for half an hour and it didn't work until I discovered that I have to manually set both the width and the height. So let's just set the height to 100% as well. And so with that, we're good to go. And actually I'm also going to set the image to a block element. So display block, because otherwise it always has these weird small white space after it, because it's treated like an inline element, and so it's like it's text. Okay, and so that should fix it. And indeed it does. And so now that part that was overlapping the figure element is now gone. Let's actually take a look at that. And so you see that the figure is right here in the grid cell, and then the image is in there. And it's now only the height of the parent element itself. And that's again because of the object fit property set to cover. Okay, so let's now actually position this item. So this is the number 1. So grid row from 1 and span 2. And this one the same. So now it's going to be bigger. Yep. And you see that it's only occupying the exact grid area that we defined. So just like we have it here. So it's now exactly the same, no longer causing the problems with the intrinsic aspect ratio that we had before. So the first image is now placed. We now know how this works and how we do all of this. So in the next video, we can then place all of the remaining images in order to make it look in the end just like this. So stay tuned and see you in a minute.